Got
Hi,
it.
Steve. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Um, just for everyone, Steve's actually one of the students in our CMGT 7400 class. And when I found out that he had a role in quality, I asked if he'd be interested to be on the series. Um, so some of you will know him and some of you won't. But jumping into that, Steve, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your role right now?
Yeah, definitely. So I do the quality control for a bridge rehab company, and mostly bridge rehab. Sometimes we'll install new bridges. Lots of ministry work, like BC Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, and different municipalities. That's generally the level. Occasionally, it might be like a forestry bridge or something like that, but that's pretty typical. And it's a fairly small company, so the upside of that is that I get to spend time doing things that are, coordinating or project managing, or today I was basically site supervising. So it gives a little bit of variety, and we've got quite a few different sites in different places. So it's really interesting and varied.
It's interesting you say that. So how many projects would you be looking after at one time?
Maybe four. We had five bridges going. We just finished one last week, so four bridges right now.
Okay. And so sorry, you said you're quality manager for these four bridges
Yeah,
now?
yeah.
And on the bridges, are there other quality people on the team, or is it that the team is the project team and they sort of have tasks related to quality?
Yeah, if there's, I try to be on hand for the things that are critical, concrete pours and, rebar and that sort of thing. Um, and if I can't be because there's some kind of a conflict between the two, then just a site supervisor will take the boxes. We've got quality assurance on everything all the time. So sometimes, especially on the smaller bridges, they're fine with that. They'll usually want me to go and have a look when there's something really important, and they'll speak up. But I try to get to the things that seem like the most important, and the bigger the project, the more stuff I try to get to. So tomorrow morning I'm up to Pemberton for a few days, and I was down in Delta for a couple of days, and so it goes.
That makes sense. And you probably see the same usual suspects in terms of the consultant teams and different people on these projects.
Yes, a lot of the same companies for sure. And I mean, especially the province uses a lot of the same. We Tetra Tech use on a lot of different things. We've got one Morrison Hirschfield, but we've seen a lot of the same people on different sites, whether it's Coquihalla or Sea to Sky and different stuff like that.
So bridge rehab. So it's interesting because the sounds like it's not new bridges per se. It's
Right.
actually a bridge that's already, whether it's in operation and maintenance phase or maybe heading towards end of life and needs rehab. So someone's come in and done an assessment of some sort,
Yeah.
and ultimately your job is doing the quality fix on. You're doing the quality for a quality fix.
Yeah. Yeah. Essentially, and it's some of them aren't in very good shape, and they're just trying to extend the life. That's pretty common. Sometimes it's just the deck, really, and bits and pieces besides that. The one that we're working on is mostly the parapets. So it depends. There's, as you know, like around the province, the weather conditions are so bad in the winter time that there tends to be lots of work. And then a lot of it is just some of the municipalities don't necessarily have the budget, so they really want things to last as long as they possibly can. So we're going in and, maybe it's steel reinforcing, structural steel, redoing the deck, that sort of thing. Lots of demolition, and yeah, it's interesting work. It's Some of it is a little bit tricky. A lot of it's pretty straightforward, and then it's mostly that it has to be close to exactly right because they're spending a lot of money and they want to make sure they're getting their money's worth. So
I know in the commercial world, the interior renovation world, one of the really hard things is to land the scope, right? You never know quite
Yeah.
what you're going to find until you actually start that demo and, look behind that wall and
Yes,
what you
very
find.
much
You find
so.
a lot of that in your line with bridge rehab as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Occasionally there's something that is better than they thought, and we don't have to spend so much time on it. Usually it's the other way around, and we find ourselves chasing cracks and deteriorations and things like that. And, rebar will be worse than expected. But this fairly small bridge down at Delta that we're working on, it's been a lot of, you find one spot and you do the demo work there, and it turns out that that leads to another area close by, and that leads to another area close by, and so it goes. So oftentimes the scope will dramatically increase, and that can be frustrating because you've got your schedule, and usually you've got something planned to go to next. So it's not so much the money usually works out. It's not necessarily quite as profitable, but it can really mess things up for getting to the next job, and or else you have to leave and go to the next job and then come back, and of course that extra mobilization is costly too.
Yeah, and it's one of these things, it looks good on paper, right? You can get compensated, all great, but the reality is when there's not that many humans to do the work, it actually is pretty tricky to have that scope creep.
Yeah, and also that what I think a lot of the owners don't realize is that when you add things on, yes, you're paying for it, but it's usually not a seamless process. There's usually some back and forth with the contract administrators and the owners and so forth. And you end up getting delayed a little bit, but not enough to really call it a delay necessarily. And then it really hurts the flow of the work, and you end up being a lot less efficient doing that. So even though you're getting paid for it, it's less profitable because it's less efficient.
So recognizing this is kind of something you have to deal with all the time. Do you
Yeah.
have specific methods where you try and capture the scope? Are there, so for example, in geotechnical, often
Mhm.
we'll go in early and say you need to do more boring, more boreholes, get more data before we go in and really finish these scope documents. Do you have that opportunity, or is it all design, bid, build, and you don't really have that opportunity?
It depends. Sometimes the contract will actually call for boreholes and call for, extra exploratory work ahead of time. And that's great. Um, Oftentimes it's just a way you go. And then if it turns out that the asphalt is, you're demolishing asphalt and it's 10 inches instead of 6 inches, then you have to go back and say, look, this is going to take us longer and it'll cost more money. And generally speaking, with the municipalities and the province, it's not that much of a problem, but it takes you extra time. And so as a contractor, you end up having to make choices or work longer hours and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. In terms of quality management system, I know we talked about this briefly in class, and you said, yeah, we sort of are based on ISO 9001, but we're not certified.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that and sort of the system that you bring to the projects?
Yeah. So before I joined the company in quality, they had put together a pretty extensive quality package based on the ISO that we were talking about, answering a lot of those questions. But a lot of it was what you would use, I don't know, in maybe if you're making cars or you're making, breakfast cereal or something like that. So a lot of the questions aren't really that relevant, although I think in the more recent versions, it's become a little more focused. So when I joined after the first couple of bridges, I went back in, went to the latest version and went through it and updated everything. So it does draw pretty heavily from that. And the a lot of what we do, the bigger projects that we do are for the province. So they refer to ISO and they say you don't have to be certified, but we'd like you to base the quality the package that you put together on that. So when we get a new job, I'll go through the contract, pull out the specs and requirements, and try and come up with checklists and things. And of course, they'll have a long list of specs that you have to check against the aggregate and fill and all that sort of stuff, maybe the paint and whatever the job requires. So there's a lot of, we've got a fairly standard, I think it's about 40 pages quality document, and it's going through and reworking it for each job and trying to capture everything that needs to be done in advance. A little bit tricky because you're doing it in your head, but all the pre-planning, all the pre-work is super useful and helps for the scheduling and all of that stuff as well.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. It seems to be a common thread. I think in buildings, I don't think the standards relied as heavily upon, but I think in the civil and infrastructure, it seems to be relied really heavily upon. So it seems to be sort of a dichotomy there. In terms of this 40-page plan you have, is there sort of an activity or task that you believe has the greatest impact on preventing quality issues or sort of supporting your system overall?
There are a couple of things I really like to do. One is taking the time to go through and get the checklists really tuned up, trying to make sure that the most important things that are specified are captured. And we talked a little bit about this in class, about going through, maybe looking at the product data sheets, digging a little bit deeper into the specs, maybe what it's pointing at, to get a sense of what needs to be done and also when. As you know, I'm sure a bunch of aggregate testing can take 90 days or, even a couple of years, depending on what it is. So making sure that the sources of things have all of their paperwork, all of their tests done. And so the biggest thing that I find useful is getting those crucial things down on paper in the checklist, but also having the time accounted for in the checklists. And then the other thing that I really appreciate that I'd like to see happen more is the pre-planning, like the pour plan, the cure plan, and all that sort of stuff. For me and for the project manager or the site supervisor and foreman, for everybody to see how it's going to happen. There's definitely some value in putting it down on paper and not just leaving it to, well, we've done this 6 times in the last year, so we're good to go. So it's really nice to see it written down. Easier to make sure that everything's accounted for. So that the checklists ahead of time, and then having some procedures written down to go through and double check everything. That's very valuable.
That's great. And do you find the checklist kind of follow? I know when I was putting checklists together, often the sequence of checks on the checklist would actually follow the flow of the procedure. So it kind of forced people to sort of be like, okay, we got a green light on this one. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Yeah, green light there.
Yeah, very much so. And I think making sure that the foreman and even the workers, depending on what's getting done, know what's on the checklist. They know what's important. Usually the people doing the work, they want to do it properly. They don't want to do it twice. And sometimes it's just a matter of communication to make sure that they're not doing it the way that they did on the last job. They're doing it the way that it's required on this one.
I was talking to the quality manager for Burnaby Hospital from Ellis Dawn, and I asked her what her job was. She said, it's just communication.
Yeah, big time. Especially you're not doing it yourself. So you have to make sure that people know, and that they know ahead of time what the expectations are. And then of course you go in and check, but nothing's more maddening to somebody doing the work than they think they did a really good job and you come in and say, oh, but this, and they're like, why didn't somebody tell me?
Yeah, exactly. In terms of trade engagement or trade buy-in, how much involvement do they have in actually creating the checklist themselves? How much accountability do they have for the quality control of their work?
Our company's it's pretty good that way. At least I like it. Most stuff is in-house. And so the team members, they don't want to have to redo it. they want to, you know, everybody wants to feel good about the work that they're doing, and they everybody feels like a part of the team. So there's a lot of buy-in, and oftentimes we're doing the same sort of work again and again, but I'll definitely talk to, we've got a few key members that have been there for a long time about, you know, what's the best way, or what, how do you like to do this? What's the approach? And generally speaking, everybody knows what went wrong and what went right, because it's a fairly small group. So it's pretty easy to, like, I make notes, you know, the sort of what did we learn kind of process. And for the next project, I'll have notes to make sure that that gets addressed, and so forth. The biggest thing is just that the fellows don't like to have to pull things apart and redo it. So they're very motivated, because it's just not fun. You're getting paid, but it's not enjoyable.
Yeah, it's really hard to quantify that cost, but it's really quite depressing.
Yeah.
There's nothing that makes you feel like you valueless than ripping out work you thought you did well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you're actually, because you self-perform, or your company self-performs, you're really both QC and QA. I think that's different than a lot of people we've interviewed, because a lot of them have been just on the QM or QA side of things. But
Yeah.
it is different, right? Because you're sort of capturing both, sort of holistically.
Yeah, and so we have QA from the owner at on the vast majority of the jobs, but it's annoying. Like, they really don't want to have to come in and deal with very much. They really want me to have made sure that it's done properly and documented it and show it to them, so that they can just have a quick look and tick their boxes and move on. So certainly working with subcontractors, as I guess most of the QC people are probably doing, like an Ellis Dawn or so forth. That's another wrinkle, certainly. And so when I do have, because we've got, you know, we've got asphalt companies that come in, concrete companies, and so forth, and it is a little bit more challenging. You don't have the same kind of relationship that you do within the company, and there's not as much accountability. So it is a little bit challenging. But that said, you also have, you know, they want to get paid, so you've got that leverage. But it's a different sort of experience working with the subcontractors versus in-house. I got to say, it is nice being in-house, for sure.
Yeah, I think the way it was described was you really have to get their buy-in. They're contractually obligated to certain things, but in truth, it's the relationship that sort of builds that path. And I remember when I was in that role, I would find I kind of just had to be a little bit useful for them to get them to do the things that I needed them to do. And whether it was sort of getting information out of my team, or being a bit of a communication link, I always felt like that kind of, it was sort of the currency I could provide. And then by providing that, they would actually do the checks that I needed them to check and get the stuff in on time. So like, she helps us out too.
if they see value in you, right, then it's much easier, I think. And there's a relationship there, and yeah, definitely.
So you're talking about materials. So you're working with concrete, steel.
Yeah.
Do you work with wood as well?
Yes. Yeah, we work with wood. The company, I wasn't on it, but there was a big trestle bridge over in the CRD in Victoria that got done. And yeah, we do, I would say it's probably 10% wood. And then it's a lot of, we put in a pedestrian bridge that was basically just dropped onto our abutments in Richmond. But it's mostly a combination of steel and concrete. The one that we're working on in Delta is using steel to reinforce, like a structural steel, to reinforce old wood piles and wood pile caps and things. So it's going to end up being kind of a Frankenstein, or that sort of thing. And there's a lot of that going on with some of the older wooden bridges to extend the life.
Are you finding any issues with where the scopes come together, with where the different structural pieces, one stops and one starts? Are you finding any quality issues
Yeah,
there?
yeah, it is. It's not so much the quality issues, more the workflow, and making sure that the different teams can work either together or one after the other, and also that the work is left in the correct condition for the next people. That's a
Right.
big challenge, because you need to know what the incoming team is looking for, what they're expecting, and what they want. And the team that's doing the work, the outgoing team, doesn't necessarily know. So they're sort of doing what they think they should, but they can make it easier or harder for the next team. So yeah, the scope and deciding what group is going to do what part of the scope is challenging. Probably the most challenging thing right now, though, and I think it's probably the same for everybody, is just getting materials, getting the steel, fabrication, and making sure that stuff can pass the spec. It's a real challenge.
Yeah, I think supply chain's been tricky. It's not only not knowing you get it last minute, and when you get it, half the time it doesn't meet the requirements, and then you're
Yeah.
having to deal with sending it back and that cycle. I want to stick back just to the challenge you talked about with the scope transfer. Do you
Mhm.
do specific meetings or something to try and address that? Like
It depends. Yeah,
handover
it depends.
meetings or
Yeah, depending on what's happening. Um, Sometimes we'll do, like, because of issues that we've had with materials, sometimes we've done a bunch of work and gone back, and done a bunch of work and gone back. So that oftentimes the people involved are, it's a different team of people altogether. So it is pretty challenging. And then it's a matter of trying to explain what they need to expect, but also try and anticipate. So going in and having a look, and I try and imagine the workflow and the doing of the work, and consider what's there, and try and figure that out and talk about it with the foreman. So that sort of stuff. But it is challenging. It's one of the bigger challenges, especially on the smaller jobs, because sometimes we're fitting them in between, or we'll do, you know, half of the work and then go do something else and come back and do the steel, which is what we're doing in Delta right now. And then, you know, come back and do the asphalt and the wrap and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's a big challenge. There's the meetings are sometimes a hard sell within, especially a smaller company, I think, because everybody's so busy and don't it's not necessarily obvious the value of it,
Mhm.
but we're trying and doing more, and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's definitely a work in progress, all of the meetings, because people just get busy. And I think, well, I don't really have time to spend. But it comes back to the pre-planning that we've been talking about so much, which is that you can save an awful lot of time by planning, and spending time on that saves you time on doing the work later on.
We've moved sort of, or at Turner, we sort of moved to more of a lean version of meetings where you're not allowed to have a sit down meeting.
Right.
Um, because the minute you sit down, people get comfortable and they just kind of step back, and all the meetings had to be under 5 minutes, and they
Oh,
had to have like
wow.
a visual whiteboard or TV there, so that not on every project, but this
Yeah.
was sort of the model, and a lot
Yeah.
of the projects do this. It was so effective because it took what could be like a 30 or 40-minute meeting, crunched it to like 5 minutes.
Nice.
Everyone was really active and came in with something, went out with something, and it really flipped that idea. Because I
Hmm.
know that was the challenge we felt too, was, if these meetings are too long, they're just pointless. And if, it's
Right.
great to have notes, but really sometimes just the process of that is too tedious for these site meetings.
That would be, it would be a fun thing to try and see how it works, because I do think that that's a little bit of, well, they tend to be half an hour or an hour or something, right? So if it was like, okay, we've got 5 minutes, 10 minutes, something, go, you know?
Yeah, 10 minutes, stand up. Here's this thing. Let's go.
That's great. Yeah, I'll suggest that. I like that.
Good luck. One more question, I guess, to ask in terms of the tools you use for your trade. I know Elsdom was using FieldWire as sort of their electronic tool. I'm just curious what you use to help you with your role.
Really, it's, yeah, nothing that's that specialized. It really is just Word and Excel and lots of drawing things and talking to people. And actually, I worked for Richmond for a little while doing basically CA work for them. And it was a lot of just having a book and writing things down and every day and documenting things. So yeah, it's still paper, lots of photos, and then Excel and Word, and that's pretty much it. And email, lots of email.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is it's all the same stuff. It's all, and I think we've talked about this in class too, where sometimes you can actually get caught up in the tools in the system and lose the process, right? Lose the meat of what you're doing. That it's always really important to figure out what those things are. You know, what would be in the Word document, what would be in the Excel document, and then if you choose to use an electronic tool to try and simplify, you can, but you don't have to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Any final takeaways you wanna share with us, or?
Well, it's interesting and it's fun. Just that it's worthwhile. It's, you know, you can do some interesting things. You get to travel around if you want to, or you can stay in one place if you want to do that. Get to deal with lots of people, which is generally speaking a good experience, I find. And I like it a lot more than just, you know, leading a work group, or because you get to see a little bit of what everybody's doing. And I find that a lot more interesting. And I think for people who maybe have a more holistic view of construction, and, you know, if you want to work towards project management or coordination or you know, that sort of thing, or site supervision, I think it's a good thing to lead you to that if that's what you're hoping to do, because it will give you the chance to see a lot of different things and really dig into the plans and really dig into the specs, which and maybe under a little bit less pressure than the project manager might have.
And the details, right? The devil's always the
Yeah.
details in the quality world.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where it all lives.
Well, thank you so much for taking this time this evening, and really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Nice to talk to you.